He started a controversial museum in Tasmania, but he wasn't David Walsh. He walked into the wilderness and returned with stunning photographs, but he wasn't Peter Dombrovskis. He saved the Gordon River from logging, but he wasn't Bob Brown. A man born on the other side of the world became one of the most famous Tasmanians of his time. But who was he? G'day and welcome to Forgotten Tasmania. If you're looking for amazing photos of Tasmania, you've come to the right place. Tasmania has a rich history. Beatty's studio has thousands of photos dating back to the 1840s. Let me show you some things about Tasmania that have been forgotten.
A man born on the other side of the world became one of the most famous Tasmanians of his time. People ask me if I'm related in some way. I grew up in a family of photographers. I asked my father how come his work was called Beatty's when our name is Stevenson. He told me about this old man who was a famous photographer, and his name was Beatty. Pop had bought the business from him, and that's why it's called Beatty's Studio. But who was John Watt Beattie? To answer that, we need to go back to Scotland in the 1870s and look at his father John Beattie Sr., an elder in the West Free Church in Aberdeen. Beattie Sr. was raising his family and earning his living as a portrait photographer. By this time he was in his 70s. The church features highly in his life, and a new minister was appointed against his wishes. He was so affected by this new minister's views on music in church, and it sounds to me like the new guy was for it and Beattie was against it, that Beattie felt he had to resign and withdraw from the church. This action was not enough, and Beattie Sr. soon decided that his family, wife Esther and 8 children, must uproot and move to the colonies to put enough distance between himself and that dreaded church music. As Beattie Sr. was almost blind by this time, John Jr. read aloud to him. One night he was reading from an illustrated book of sheep farming in Australia. Beattie Sr. had an epiphany and decided to send young John, all of 18 at the time, to spy out the land and find them a new home on the other side of the world. His dutiful son arrived in Melbourne, armed with letters of introduction, and made investigations both in Victoria and Tasmania. He was soundly told that times were bad and businesses were failing. It was not the right time. He told his father this, but nothing would sway Beattie Sr., and so out to Tasmania they came. In 1878 they settled on 320 acres on a property called Murray Hall at Mount Lloyd near New Norfolk, and sheep farm they did until the money ran out and they went broke. John describes the land as beautiful, quoting Charles Barrett, "Doubtless God could have made a lovelier valley, but doubtless he never did." Beattie also wrote that bushland clearing was not to his taste. This is our first hint of his conservationist views to come. In 1879 he made a photographic expedition to Lake St Clair. He borrowed his father's horse, hired a mail cart, and with 2 other gentlemen they set off for the lake. There he exposed gelatin dry plates. One of the men, Mr Alex Riddick, offered to put up £200 to start John in business if he would come to Hobart, but it seems John declined. His time on the land made young John Watt Beattie grow up fast. The workers on the farm were former Port Arthur convicts. He describes the experience as being soaked in lore and romance of Port Arthur. Not words we'd use today to describe a notorious penal settlement, but I get the feeling that Port Arthur made a great impact on him. In 1882, one of the Anson brothers came up to Murray Hall by horse and cart and offered John a position in their photographic studio at Elizabeth Street, Hobart. This time John accepted and he moved to Hobart to make his fortune. He worked for the Ansons until 1891, when he bought out the last surviving brother and renamed the business Beattie Studio. It's still operating under that name today. Beattie had success almost immediately he took over the business. When he bought it, the business had only 1 floor. Soon it took over the whole building, 3 stories, a museum, library, huge studio that could hold 80 people, separate labs for chemicals and printing. It was a serious enterprise. Beattie was a prolific wilderness photographer long before anyone coined that term. He didn't have colour, bokeh, shallow depth of field, and other photographic techniques that we take for granted today. The simple cameras of the day took more skill to operate. There was no point and shoot. Beattie had to understand light, the emulsion, the chemistry, and every aspect of the process. He said, "I've been essentially an outdoor man. I love the bush, and nothing gives me greater delight than to stand on some high land and look out on a wild array of our giant mountains. I am struck dumb, but oh how my soul sings." Cato claims Beattie regarded the West Coast as his true home, and he had it to himself most of the time. He could walk onto mountaintops through rainforest wilderness and see savage, primeval, sombre beauty. Cato was fond of flowery words, but it seems obvious to us now that the West Coast had, and still has, some of the most beautiful scenery on the planet. and Beatty photographed most of it. He may not have been the first to all of it, but he's certainly the most well known, and more of his work has survived than any of the other photographers of his time. The previous technology was the wet plate system, but with his dry plate camera, Beatty was able to go places never photographed before. There was no need to lug chemicals and a darkroom tent, although the 15 by 12 inch camera loaded with a plate weighed 60 pounds or 27 kilos. He later lamented that he could have taken a smaller camera and done more, but given the extent of his portfolio, I doubt that he could have done more. He married Emily Cox Cato on the 28th of October 1886 in Hobart, Tasmania. In 1895 their first daughter, Jean Franklin Beatty, was born, followed in 1898 by their second daughter, Muriel Denison Beatty. Beatty kept a museum and lending library. This didn't sit well with everyone. I recall reading a letter to the newspaper from a visitor to the estate who lamented the private ownership of such a fine collection of colonial Tasmanian artefacts. What they missed was that Beatty was the one who bought them when the government didn't want them, they wanted to get rid of them. Beatty promoted Port Arthur, collecting relics in a time when Tasmanians wanted to forget or hide the state's convict past. Having a convict in your ancestry was known as the hated stain of convictism and was something to be ashamed of. In the lead up to the filming of For the Term of His Natural Life in 1926, there was much public talk of covering up the convict past. The Attorney General, Mr. Ogilvie, even suggested that the censorship board ban the screening of the film in Tasmania. In 1921, Beatty spoke out against the destruction of records. He acquired original pardons, tickets of leave and other documents. Records of the convict past were suppressed until the 1970s. I recall around that time my father quietly selling some of these documents to the convicts' surviving relatives at their extreme insistence. I presume they were covering up even then. It seems to be that the anti-transportation movement was centred in Launceston, and this may have been the start of the north-south divide that exists in some form still today. The Anti-Transportation League was formed in Launceston in 1849. Van Diemen's Land was renamed Tasmania in 1855. Beatty was a patron of the arts and an art collector. He purchased paintings by Gould, Forrest and other noted painters of the day. Beatty was an early tourism promoter. He arrived in Hobart as a wilderness photographer just as the tourism industry was starting. There was a lack of photos to go with the wonderful things that were being written and said about Tasmania. This created the perfect market conditions and Beatty worked that market well. Beatty was a founding member of the Tasmanian Tourism Board, a member of the Royal Society of Tasmania, a member of the Minerva Club, a member of the Field Naturalists Club, and a charter member of the Hobart Lodge of the Theosophical Society. It seems he was interested in everything from science, history and the occult. Before the movie industry started, Beatty had a travelling lecture tour. He made lantern slides of some of his photos and toured the state giving talks that he'd illustrated with his slides. At least 6 of these are known, and we have the booklets of the speeches. These lantern slides spread around the world and were very common in England. From his biography by Michael Rowe, making a business of Tasmania never corrupted Beatty. While sometimes over-imaginative in historical reconstruction with pen and camera, he had a scholarly sense. His accounts of Port Arthur, for example, steered between sensation and sentimentality, and he confronted the horror of European-Tasmanian relations. He said, "For about 30 years this ancient people held their ground bravely against the invaders of their beautiful domain." He wrote about the Aboriginals. Beatty's photos were used on Tasmanian postage stamps from 1899 to 1912. 8 stamps were made, 5 of which had Beatty photos. They were used to promote the state and the tourism. He'd become such an expert on the West Coast that the Tasmanian Parliament paid him to answer members' questions on matters of road and rail planning, water and timber resources and the likes. Beatty was a conservationist, speaking out against industrial development on the West Coast. In a paper to Parliament in 1908, Beatty says, "Pining, as carried out in the Gordon and vicinity today, is mostly confined to the creeks and small rivers which flow into the main stream. All the pine timber which grew so abundantly at one time along the banks and in the adjacent flats has been worked out years ago. In the view of the annually increasing scarcity of suitable timber for the world's requirements, it would appear to be a matter deserving of great attention at the hands of government to endeavour by every means within its power not only to conserve the existing forests, but to take every step possible to increase the supply of so valuable a timber, with possibilities in the future of considerable magnitude." Apart from the aesthetic side of the Gordon's attractions, its scientific aspect, as contributing to a unique display of our West Coast flora, must become apparent to all and should alone warrant beyond question its rigid protection against axe and fire.
Beatty's efforts in lobbying Parliament were successful and those areas were protected for the time being. But Beatty was also for mineral exploration and other types of industry, so he had that balance between conservation on the one hand and development on the other, and that's something that we probably still haven't got right to this day.
In 1906, Beatty set off on the Southern Cross to explore the Pacific. He travelled to Sydney on the SS Jonah and then on to Auckland on the SS Monowai to join the SS Southern Cross, which took him around the Pacific region. The SS Pupura had already delivered a shipment of photographic glass plates ready to load for the voyage. He spent 3 months at sea and returned with thousands of photos and a tropical infection that was hard to heal. He visited numerous islands such as Mare, Raga, Villa, Lotawai, Vanuatu, the Torres Islands, the Solomon Islands, Fiji and many more. Of note was his brief stop on the Solomons, where he visited the Lever Brothers plantation, Sunlight Soap, and met ladies named Kitchen. I wonder if they went on to become Lever and Kitchen, and then Unilever, with brands like Omo, Dove, Lux and Sunsilk to their name. In 1911, Roald Amundsen won the race to be the first to the South Pole. He sailed to Hobart, and the only man he would trust to process his historic photo was John Watt Beattie. The only surviving original print is in the National Library, made by Beattie himself. We have copies of the negatives in the collection today. Beattie recognised the Tasmanian Aboriginals and lamented their fate at the hands of European settlers. Beattie was not perfect. His purchase and marketing of photos under his own name that he hadn't taken himself upset some people. I don't think Beattie ever claimed to have taken all these photos, just that he owned them, although don't try telling that to the descendants of Thomas Nevin today. Beattie wasn't into self-promotion or driving his business out of the reach of the ordinary customer. Much of Beattie's story is told by Jack Cato, his cousin. At times Cato's not completely accurate. He can be a tad flowery and a bit overstated. Cato was the one who promoted Beattie. He even suggests that Robert Louis Stevenson may have been inspired to write Treasure Island after seeing Beattie's work. Jack Cato took Beattie's work to England. His lantern slides are still more available there than they are in Australia. Cato told him to charge more. Beattie refused. Even long after his trip to the Pacific, Beattie's health seems to have declined, and his thoughts turned to retirement. Sometime around 1925, Beattie approached Arch Stevenson, a photographer in Launceston working for Van Dyck Studio, and lured him to Hobart to further Beattie's portrait photography business. Arch would go on to purchase the studio in 1933. The 1927 sale of the Beattie Museum was a long-winded, politically charged affair. Launceston decided to invest in the collection to attract tourists. It was eventually broken up into 2 parts, one going to the Queen Victoria Museum. Hobart refused to purchase the remaining collection for numerous reasons, until later when a benefactor provided funds to the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery.
On the 24th of June 1930, Beattie left work, went to the Cato household in South Hobart, and then from there he was to walk to Sandy Bay to meet up with his wife at a friend's house where they were having dinner. He arrived at the friend's house, collapsed in a chair and passed away, an apparent heart attack. He was 71. He's buried at Cornelian Bay Cemetery in Hobart. Beattie's personal story ends there, but the business to which he gave his name continues even today, and that's another forgotten story that I can't wait to tell you.